California is the world's fifth largest economy. The San Pedro Bay ports represent the ninth largest harbor complex in the world. Our ports are the engine driving the economy forward, but a powerful engine is only as strong as its components. The Harbor Association of Industry and Commerce is the collective and impactful voice supporting the harbor business community for the last 40 years. Our goal is to propel this robust community forward into the future of industrial and commercial trade. Collectively, we strive to advance our members' business through cost-effective and responsible solutions, efficient standards, and advocate for robust industry legislation. Visit harbораssn.com to learn more.
Hello, and welcome to this special episode of Trade Talks. I'm Tom O'Brien with the Center for International Trade and Transportation at California State University, Long Beach. This year, Trade Talks is embarking on a tour of California's diverse and economically vital maritime and inland water ports. This series is a co-production with the Harbor Association of Industry and Commerce. The HAIC was established in 1975 to be a collective voice and advocate for the harbor community on issues related to trade, transportation, and environmental and land use issues. The HAIC is also committed to workforce development, ensuring that the harbor community and the many businesses which serve it have a steady stream of talent, and here at Cal State Long Beach, we are grateful for their support. Today's focus, and appropriately, it's on Ports Day here in California, is on the Port of Stockton, and my guest is Port Director Kirk DeJesus. At a time when the Southern California ports have been in the spotlight because of global trade disruptions, it's good to be reminded that supply chains in general, and in California in particular, are so much more than containers. Please join me as we turn our attention inland on this special edition of Trade Talks. Hello. I'm Tom O'Brien with the Center for International Trade and Transportation at California State University, Long Beach. And welcome to a special episode of Trade Talks, sponsored by the Harbor Association of Industry and Commerce. My guest today is the Port of Stockton's director, Kirk DeJesus. Mr. DeJesus has been working within the maritime industry for almost 2 decades in operations and business development. He's worked for several ports across North America, which we'll hear about in a little bit, in a number of different capacities. On the land side, he's helped to bring renewable fuels to West Coast terminal operators, and we'll get to learn a little bit more about that as well. But in the meantime, let me say welcome and hello to Kirk. Welcome to Trade Talks.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate the opportunity.
I want to get started and learn a little bit more about Stockton and the Port of Stockton and what you do, but there's an adage in the industry that when you've seen one port, you've seen one port, and I think that's truly the case with some of California's smaller ports. You've spent some time now on the maritime side of transportation, but you actually started your transport career in the air. How and why did you make that transition?
Well, I started my first 14 years as a pilot. I was an Air Force pilot for 10 years, and I flew for the airlines for 4 years after that. After 9/11, I was laid off, and I started a real estate appraisal company. I ran that for a few years, and then started working for Kinder Morgan, which is a midstream energy company, and I worked on the terminal side for them. I did operations in California, and then I did commercial development and business development commercial operations all through the Pacific Northwest and down into California. When this opportunity came up in Stockton for the port director, it was the right place at the right time. So the transition from being an airline pilot to working in the maritime industry was just something that happened. It just kind of fell in my lap, thankfully.
There must be sort of common concerns, issues. What do you draw upon from your experience that makes the most sense in the maritime environment?
Between the airline?
Yeah.
Labor concerns, I think, are probably the biggest thing. The airline industry is heavily unionized, and the maritime side, especially here in California, is as well. So that's a primary concern. Working conditions, more of a personnel issue than a logistics issue. The logistics part which is critical in the airline industry. It's not something that pilots really worry about, to be honest with you.
Interesting. You're at the Port of Stockton now, and you took over at one of the most disruptive times in our recent and probably longer term memory as well. Can you talk a little bit about sort of stepping into the position at a time of such global disruption?
Sure. I mean, from a personal level, it was difficult because I started back in May, so I've only been there 9 months. And having the personnel spread out and some people working from home was difficult. Trying to come in and get a handle on the operations was trying at best. It still is. We're still not all back to work yet. Hopefully that'll happen soon. As far as from global trade, Stockton's a break bulk and bulk port, so we weren't tremendously impacted by the COVID pandemic as other ports may have been, because the labor component is a little bit smaller when you're dealing with break bulk and bulk. So the supply chain issues with containers and all that hasn't really hit us. It's actually been a benefit to the Port of Stockton. So I'm coming in at a time of growth. We've had our best year revenue-wise and volume-wise this past calendar year. So from that perspective, I'm coming in at a really good time.
We'll talk a little bit about the relationship between the port sectors in a bit, but I think it's probably worth sharing with our audience a bit of a background about what a break bulk and a bulk terminal does, or a port, since so often the orientation is containerized trade, particularly in this state. So could you talk a little bit about both the operations, what you do, what you move, as well as maybe a little bit about the community that the port's embedded in, Stockton?
Sure. So I'll take that first. So Stockton's located, a lot of people don't know, 70 miles east of San Francisco Bay. It's an inland port, obviously, and we're about 50 miles south of Sacramento. It's an agricultural area. So the majority of what we do is fertilizer from an import, bulk fertilizer and bagged fertilizer, which that's the break bulk component of it. Export-wise, we do export some ag, but not a lot, to be honest with you. We do a lot of rice, but we don't see the volume of fertilizer we put out to the community. We don't see that in return in the export ags. Most of it's going out container. But we can talk about that later. That's just a thought process.
So for somebody who's only seen a containerized port, either on the ground or in pictures,
Sure.
What would they see when they go to the Port of Stockton? What would it look like to them?
It's something less mechanized. We use a lot of ship's gear when we're loading and unloading. Obviously, we do break bulk, that can be steel, that can be super sacks. That is a lot of ship's gear, a lot of workforce, a lot of manual labor on that. Bulk are clamshells into hoppers, into conveyors. So we have a lot of conveyors, and like I said, we don't have shore cranes. We have 2 mobile cranes that we can use, but most of it's used with the ship's gear.
And can you give us a sense of the size of the facility and
Sure.
operations, that sort of
Yeah,
thing?
absolutely. So the Port of Stockton is separated into 2 different islands. There's an east island and a west island. The east island is 600 acres. The west island is 1,400 acres. So we have 2,000 operational acres, and then we have an additional 2,200 acres upriver where we place dredge material when we do dredge. We have 12,000 lineal feet of dock space. We have 14 berths. We have 7 million square foot of storage, and we have about 75 miles of rail inside the port.
It's a big operation, and you've got a workforce as well that includes terminal operations as well as unionized dock worker labor?
We do. So the ILWU does all the dock work. We're somewhat unique when you get off the berth. It's non-union labor. So we have 143 tenants. We have 2 major stevedores at the port, which are unionized. The Port of Stockton, my staff is 120 people, but we do have some union workforce there. We're unique that we're an operating port also. So we do some fertilizer, inbound and packaging with our port staff.
That's actually an important distinction. Can you talk a little bit about an operating port versus a landlord port, which is, again, probably what most people might be familiar with?
Yeah, and I think that's the route that most ports are taking, is being a landlord and having leasehold. That's the majority of what we do, but we do have a small, we do want to keep the ability to take inquiries and move the volume if we have the ability to do so. We still can't order the labor. We're not a PMA member.
Pacific Maritime
Association. So we still have to engage one of our stevedores to do that. But the overall operation is run by our ops folks.
I think it would surprise people as well to hear that Stockton is an inland deep water port. Right?
Yeah, deep water is a stretch maybe. We hope to keep 35 feet. So we're on the San Joaquin River. Like I said, it's a 70-mile trip from the bay. We have river pilots that bring the vessels in to us because it can be tricky. So we have 13 river pilots that are trained and can move the vessels in. So it's kind of unique if you're sitting, drive along I-5 to see a ag field and then see a vessel come in is kind of unique. So.
And you referenced the fact that you have a particular niche with things like fertilizer, but I know sometimes referring to smaller ports as niche ports, plays differently in different audiences. Do you consider yourself a niche port, and how does that relate to other ports in the state?
Well, we're different because we are break bulk and bulk, so that's a little bit different. We don't do containers yet. We're hoping that there may be an opportunity to do some export containers for some agricultural products. I wouldn't say we're a niche port. We are fairly diverse on our commodity, from sulfur, coal, liquid bulk and dry bulk, steel products, ag products, fertilizers. So we try and keep a diverse commodity grouping.
Break bulk and bulk facilities really do play a vital role in moving goods throughout the state and to markets everywhere. What kind of impact does the port have on it from an economic perspective on your region and on the state as a whole?
Yeah, significant in the region for sure. We provide $630 million in income tax revenue to the area. The value of commodity that runs through the Port of Stockton is $1.4 billion per year. So we do about 5 million tons a year, and import and export. We're about 60-40 import to export, and we provide about just under 11,000 jobs at the port. So.
Is that 60-40 balance where you want to be? Would you like to?
No, I'd like to be a net export port, and we have the opportunity to do that. We're working with some bulk export customers to run significant volume through in the near future.
And has that been challenging during the pandemic, or is this a good time to be pursuing new opportunities?
Well, doing a new business is always challenging. Trying to bring new volume through is always challenging from an environmental standpoint, from timing, capital. So that's not pandemic driven. As far as getting new business, the pandemic has probably helped us a little bit because with the supply chain disruption, we're seeing a different way of thinking is carriers are starting to move their commodities out of containers and run them break bulk, and we're a good outlet for that.
And who do you view as your competitors? Who are you concerned about sort of when you're looking at business development?
Probably some of the Pacific Northwest ports, just based on where our commodities are coming from. If you're looking at soda ash, where the mines are, where they're coming from the Pacific Northwest ports are probably our biggest competitor. There aren't really any California ports that do what we do, or maybe that want to do what we do. So I think if you look at the Port of Vancouver, USA, and Portland, they're probably our yeah.
And you referenced sort of your region in the Central Valley. How much of a role does that location play in your proximity to it in terms of the opportunities that you have to grow?
Yeah, we're fortunate that we lie right on I-5, Interstate 5, and Highway 99. The UP Railroad and the BN intersect in Stockton, so that's beneficial. We provide, of all the fertilizers used in Central Valley, 95% of it goes through the Port of Stockton. So that's probably our biggest draw from an ag perspective. But the availability of laydown space, the availability of rail, that's a benefit that we have also. We have space right now that we can move things that other ports may not be able to, as long as it's coming in the mode that we can handle.
Yeah, and that's certainly space is an advantage, and if you have it, particularly when we're focusing so much on bottlenecks and lack of space and lack of available facilities for pop-up locations because of the pandemic. I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, which is the soda ash project that you're talking about. I think that might be illustrative for the audience to hear a little bit more about how that could be an opportunity for the port moving forward.
Yeah, so soda ash is it's used in flat glass manufacturing. It's used in a lot of different things, but the best soda ash in the world, natural soda ash, comes out of Green River, Wyoming. Right now, the majority of it moves through the Pacific Northwest. There are some constraints with rail and availability to offload at ports with mine expansion that's happening. So one of the major producers is looking for an outlet, and they decided after an exhaustive search that Stockton was their best option. So we've been working with them for a couple of years, well before I got there. And
I was saying, what does that mean in terms of facilities and workforce and any specialized needs that you may have because of this particular product?
Significant. It's rail infrastructure is our biggest challenge. The unit trains that this would bring in are large 190 car unit trains, so we need to add rail capacity. So we're working on that right now. Rail hardening, rail bridge, additional tracks, things like that. The volume increase could effectively double our volume, so it's significant. So I would say the rail component is probably the biggest thing. The other issue is going to be ship traffic and how we deal with that, and how we deal with increasing our river pilots. That's another challenge.
What's the lead time for a new rail system, rail capacity development?
2 to 3 years, assuming the capital's available. Construction, we hope, will start early 23, and we hope to be up and running fully by mid-25.
And in terms of additional traffic, do you need to be concerned about competition in the channel from other ports? Is that an issue at all?
No, not in the channel from other ports necessarily. Our challenge is when you're increasing your volume that dramatically is being able to service all the vessels that come through. So our vessel calls, like I said, we had record vessel calls this past year, almost 300 vessel calls, and we expect that to not necessarily double, but pretty close. So being able to service those vessels and having the river pilots that can service those vessels, that's our biggest challenge right now.
Among, I assume, other workforce challenges that you're going to have.
For sure, yeah, absolutely. That's been one challenge we have had, and that's been COVID related with the ILWU not being able to travel. So we have had vessels that maybe sit a little bit longer than typical because we can't get traveling workforce to help. As far as getting additional ILWU labor in place, that's something that we're working on now. And that's a PMA function, and that's a stevedore function. So it's a collaborative effort to get these folks trained before we need them, and that's the challenge.
Yeah, and we'll have a chance to talk about that after we take a brief pause. When we come back, I want to talk to Kirk about some of the challenges facing Stockton and the California trade sector in general, and I think we'll revisit this issue of a traveling workforce, which I think is interesting as well. This is Trade Talks. I'm Tom O'Brien. We'll be right back.
Go to that.
I don't remember how it started. Our back and forth. Victory. Fumble. Repeat. It always came back.
Dad! Okay, here we go, throw it!
You probably don't remember what you told me,
That was perfect.
but I heard every word.
Nice.
Observe a domesticated human family in their natural habitat, known to their species as the backyard.
Hey, you think I should light it now?
I think it's good.
Yeah.
Oh dear, someone is about to burn a pile of debris that's too tall, which can start a wildfire. Wait, could it be? Blimey, it is.
It's Smokey.
It's Smokey Bear. What a legend.
What's he
Hey,
doing
it's
here?
Smokey. Sorry, it was too high. Right.
Watch as he astutely ensures that there's no wind, and how he removes some of the debris to create a smaller, safer burning pile.
No, you
me to
said,
make it big.
no, you said make it bigger, baby. The bigger, the better.
Take note of
Right,
our fearless
I get it.
furry friend here, humans.
I appreciate it. Fist bump.
He watching you.
Smokey's done it again.
Bye, Smokey.
Only you can prevent wildfires.
Welcome back to Trade Talks. I'm Tom O'Brien with California State University Long Beach, and I'm here today with my guest, Kirk DeJesus, Port Director at the Port of Stockton. Kirk is here thanks to the generous support of the Harbor Association of Industry and Commerce, which is co-sponsoring our year-long check-in with the state of California's port directors. Kirk, before the break, we were talking about the unique role that the Port of Stockton plays as a bulk and break bulk port and some of the new opportunities you're pursuing to expand your reach. I want to talk a little bit more about some of the challenges, and just before the break, you mentioned the challenge related to the workforce and the fact that you relied to a certain extent on a traveling workforce. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, because that may not be also something that most people think about when they look at a port complex.
Yeah, so the IWU, at least in the Bay Area, does have the ability to travel. So if the Port of Stockton has additional work that our hall cannot handle, then we can request additional labor that may come from the Bay Area. And with the COVID pandemic, there were travel restrictions in place, so they weren't able to travel. What we saw in this, the Port of West Sacramento had a real big problem with this, because a lot of the rice is exported from the Port of West Sacramento. They couldn't get the labor, so that tonnage was diverted down to the Port of Stockton. So it works both ways. It benefited us from a volume perspective to the tune of about 300% increase in volume, but it also hinders us at times if Oakland's busy or San Francisco's busy, or Richmond, wherever that labor force may be needed, that we can't get it. So we could have vessels sitting and just idling and waiting for work.
And is this a problem that was unique to the pandemic, or something that you have to deal with on a regular basis?
I would say it was exacerbated by the pandemic for sure. It's something that happens, but not to the degree that it does with the travel restrictions.
You're reminding us all, I think, of something, which is that California's port systems are in fact that. It's a system, right? And something that impacts one port may actually be felt in another port. And I wanted to get your opinion on that a little bit, because the pandemic really sort of has most visibly impacted the container ports in the state of California for reasons that you mentioned. But apart from the workforce issues and perhaps some new business opportunities with the rice, what has the pandemic and its wake meant for you and the Port of Stockton?
Well, it's impacted our personnel for sure. It's made it a lot more difficult at least for my staff, and this spreads out to everyone at the port. We're busier, so they're working harder. We have fewer people. It's harder to hire people. So it's been a stress on them for the last couple of years at this point, and it's not getting better. So until we can get through this and start getting more people back in the office and getting more people hired, it's going to continue, unfortunately.
Some of the other challenges, at least down here in Southern California, have been connected to the availability of equipment, available warehousing and distribution space, mean, all of the components of the supply chain have been stress points. Is that the case with you and Stockton and bulk and break bulk facilities, or is it a little different?
It's a little different, but it is a challenge. Our warehouse space, as I mentioned, we have 7 million square feet of warehouse space, and we're at capacity. We do have some laydown space. The challenges that we don't see that some of the container ports may see is availability of containers and chassis and truckers. We don't rely on that like they do. What we'd like to see is the opportunity to export some containerized products out of Stockton. The problem we have there is getting the empty containers. So we're working with the Port of Oakland to try and alleviate some of their, because they have these empty containers, they don't have a place to put them. So if we can get them into Stockton and then get some of the traditional ag exporters to load those containers in the area and then send them out through Stockton, that might help mitigate some of the problems that they're having in Oakland.
And is that a short-term solution, or is that something that you'd be interested in over the longer term? Oakland may not, but...
Yeah, I don't know if it's that big a hit to Oakland, to be honest with you. I would like to see the ag exports from the Central Valley and from Stockton go out of the Port of Stockton. It makes sense. Every container that we can move gets one truckload off of the Interstate 580. So if we can do that, that's obviously environmental help, but it's also benefit from a cost perspective to the exporters as well.
We've seen an evolution in the interest of sort of containerizing what was never containerized before. What do you see the increased opportunity from containerized cargo in a port like yours coming from?
Well, what we have seen, cargo that's typically containerized, we've seen about a 30% increase in volume that would normally be in containers that the manufacturers are just taking out of containers and moving break bulk. So that's been a benefit to us for sure. Some of those commodities can't. We have seen some vessels divert that would normally be coming into LA Long Beach. We just had one last week that diverted. It was break bulk and came up to Stockton and unloaded and was back on the way before it could even get a berth spot at the Port of LA, just because of their congestion. So getting them to think differently on, I guess, getting us noticed that we are an alternative is something that we'd like to see happen.
Do you see an increased use of, or a demand for changes in landside operations because of this, the potential increased use of containerized?
We do. We're working on, there's an inland port study, which is being pushed by the Port of Long Beach in LA and the Fresno Council of Governments, and it's trying to get containerized volume off the roads and onto rail, and part of that would come through Stockton, not the Port of Stockton, but through Lathrop, California, a piece of property we're working on there. So it's more of a hub and spoke. But the goal there is, because of the unavailable truckers, and chassis, to get those on rail and get them off the roads.
A lot of this is driven by the pandemic, but do you see some long-term shifts in how supply chains operate as a result of these past 18 months to 2 years? To your point about this study, better cooperation or collaboration among the supply chain stakeholders, for example?
For sure, we've seen a lot of that lately, and we've got great organizations that we work with that get all the ports together. At least in California, the California Association of Port Authorities is great. The APP, the Associated Pacific Ports, okay. They're fantastic. So, working together with other directors, I've been working with the director at the Port of Oakland, as I mentioned. So it is a holistic problem. The concern, I think, is how do we get people to change the way they think? Right now, what we're seeing is a shift in vessel size, and that would be what would go through Stockton. These feeder-sized vessels that can take 2,000 TEUs as opposed to 18,000 TEUs. So getting
the TEU being a 20-foot equivalent unit.
I'm sorry, yes,
standard size, yeah.
Thank you. So it's a shift in thought. It's also a shift in thought, at least from where I stand, from the export ag folks, is getting them to realize they don't need to send it in containers. We could ship it break bulk for them. But that's a shift in thought, and that takes time.
One of the things I've also been reading about is sort of an increased awareness of and maybe interest in information sharing through more and better digital platforms that connect the components of the supply chain in a way that makes it more transparent and visible. Do you see that as well?
To be honest with you, not really. I think what we're dealing now are the logistics problems, the hardware problems. That's been the focus, at least from where the Port of Stockton's involved. How do we get the commodities to move? How do we physically get those to move? So,
one of the other things that's been front and center, at least here in California, is the regulatory environment. So I want to turn our attention there for a minute, if we could. I think one of the things that the industry has been trying to do is sort of balance its response to rapidly growing consumer demand with the state's mandates and its priority to advance zero-emission technology and create a more sustainable freight system, which I think everybody agrees is a good thing. But sometimes there's inherent tension in those two goals, particularly in the short term. Is that a phenomenon of the container port world, or is that something you're experiencing as well?
No, I'll call it California ports are need to be responsible. We actually worked with the ports of Long Beach on a grant to electrify a large portion of our equipment. So we have 36 electrified forklifts. We are working on a grant, or we just received a grant for replacing trucks that we have. So 5 trucks per year that we're working on. So,
what's the size of the fleet that we're talking about?
The trucks?
Yeah.
We probably have 20 trucks that we need to replace.
Okay.
And that'll just be small, just operations type trucks. But the 60% of our work fleet of forklifts is electrified already. So we're working with, like I said, we worked with the Port of Long Beach. We're working with our stevedores to try and make that happen. So that's going to happen and needs to happen. Emission capturing systems is another thing that we need to work through. We've been down to Long Beach and looked at some of their private stevedores, what they have in place. So that's something that will happen. That's a little trickier solution for us and costly on how we would, whether it be land-based or barge-based. But that's something we're working through now, because everyone's going to have the same issue. So we do share thoughts on that. Obviously, it's a different level when you're talking to LA, Long Beach, Oakland than the Port of Stockton.
But it sounds like it's one instance where sort of the big brother, so to speak, helps you in some ways, having their experience, having.
Sure,
yeah,
for sure. And if we're going for a federal or a state grant and in conjunction with the Port of Long Beach, that helps us.
Sure. And to give credit to the state, it is taking a closer look at how it can facilitate trade through the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development. The governor's budget, I think, is evidence of that to a certain extent. What policy measures, though, would you like to see that would be most helpful to the work you do at the Port of Stockton? Or is it a matter of, sort of getting out of the way?
I hate to say it's a matter of getting out of the way. If you're a responsible port, which we are, and I think there are some vital environmental concerns. There are public concerns that we have. Our environmental staff has done a great job, and we have outreach committees with the local community. We're working with our local assembly and our local congressmen. So I think everyone's working together to try and make things happen. I haven't seen, to be honest with you, too many stumbling blocks, especially, again, 9 months in. That may change, but I think the biggest thing is, for us, is there are some environmental constraints that are going to happen, and the timing could be tricky on those if we can get those done in the time frame that the state's requiring. I don't know if they're taking into consideration the amount of work it takes for a port, for example, that is so reliant. So that's something that I think will be talked about more in the future. Right now, all the talk has been on supply chain congestion, right, and COVID and how we deal with that.
What about an appropriate role for the federal government? One of the things that's been interesting is to sort of see the increased attention, with obvious reason, But one of the things that I've observed sort of as a researcher is that, we have not always had a national freight policy, and, competition is good among the states and the port sectors, but sometimes it's not always the most efficient approach when we're competing with other nations that do have sort of national freight strategies. Do you see an appropriate role for Washington to play in helping the trade sector across the board, but here in California as well?
That's a real big question, and it would take a lot of time. And I don't know how ingrained we are in our roles of competition to make that happen, to be honest with you. So personally, I don't think that would work right now. I think the competition is good. I think it's necessary. So having it federalized, I think would be a problem.
What about since you referenced sort of industry response and sort of doing what it can, what part can industry play to sort of address some of the challenges that have been revealed most dramatically during the pandemic? Maybe it's equipment mismatches, maybe it's lack of availability of containers. What would you like to see industry do to help itself?
Well, I think if you mentioned lack of availability of containers, that's probably the biggest thing that's causing the crisis right now, to be honest with you. I did see yesterday that California State, did develop 6 lay-down spots for containers to try and get the empty containers space, get them off berth. So that's a benefit for sure.
You've used lay-down space a couple of times. Tell us a little bit more about
lay-down space is just empty, whether it's finished concrete pad or dirt, just space where we can lay down
for
containers, staging, steel, whatever it might be. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I interrupted you on where you were going with.
No. So I think that's the biggest challenge now. And from where the Port of Stockton stands, we don't have the same challenges that Long Beach or LA or Oakland may. But I think drivers is probably the biggest issue right now. Truck drivers.
And any suggestions on how that problem can be addressed?
I would say that's beyond my pay grade, but I really don't know. There may be restrictions on age restrictions and things like that could be lifted.
Getting 18-year-olds in the cab. I know that is one thing that's being looked at as well. And what types of forums would be helpful in having industry sort of hash out over these issues and maybe communicate them to Sacramento in a way that's effective?
Well, we've seen some. Just 2 weeks ago, we had a select committee, the State Assembly did, on goods and movement, which was very beneficial. So we had a couple ports play a part in that. It was focused on ag, but we had ag growers, we had truckers. So they have been getting all players involved in these discussions, which I think was very beneficial.
Yeah. And on that positive note, I think we'll take another pause. When we come back, I'd like you to look forward in the future and talk a little bit about what you see coming down the pike with regard to trade in California and perhaps elsewhere. We'll be right back with Trade Talks.
This is the story of a boy who didn't talk for a long time. The boy liked things to always be the same. Any changes would scare and upset him. The unknown was an unfriendly place. The boy was very sensitive to lights and sounds. So he built secret hiding places where they couldn't get in. The boy didn't like looking people in the eye. He wasn't trying to be mean, it just made him feel uncomfortable. Sometimes he would flap his arms again and again.
One day, I found out I have something called autism. My family got me help. Slowly, I found my voice and learned all the ways I could live with it better.
Early intervention can make a lifetime of difference. Learn the signs at autismspeaks.org.
Maybe you can make retirement happen. After all, you made her college years happen. opening that education savings account when she was little, spearheading a campus tour, and another, and another, and another, and another. Bam! Deciphering financial aid. She was like, what? And now she's like, you aced planning for college. Now get the tips you need to get on track at aceyourretirement.org.
Welcome back to Trade Talks. I'm Tom O'Brien. This is a production of California State University, Long Beach, sponsored by the Harbor Association of Industry and Commerce. My guest is Kirk DeJesus, Port Director at the Port of Stockton. Kirk, I want to talk a little bit about the future of trade, if I could, pick your brain a bit. I'd like you to look into your crystal ball, because a little while ago I asked what changes brought about by the supply chain are likely to be with us long term. But I'm curious what other factors are going to be determining what trade looks like in 10, 15, 20 years from now. And I think a good place to start is technology and its impact not only in the trade sector, but probably at the level of society as a whole. So what changes do you see in both the short term and the long term in port operations that result from increased use of more advanced technologies?
Well, I would say from a bulk and break bulk perspective, there's not much of a technology advantage. It's labor intensive, and there's not a lot of automation that can happen. Part of that plays into the labor component as well. Automation means less workforce, so that's something that will be fought against. But for what we do, just moving bulk and break bulk, there's not a tremendous amount of automation on berth. As far as tracking commodities and things like that, right now it's done on paper. So there is an opportunity to make that a little more efficient with a digitized operation there. But as far as moving the commodity, I don't see much of a change there. Obviously, there's more automation that can happen with container force. But when you're emptying a hold of a ship, it can't be automated. The human eye needs to see where to go and where to pick on that. So, what
about changes on the vessel side? Do you see sort of anything dramatic?
I do from hydrogen-based vessels possibly, or LNG as opposed to carbon. That's probably the biggest change that we'll see.
And is that something that's going to sort of trickle down from experimentation in other sectors that will come to break bulk and bulk later, or do you see innovation within the sector?
Well, I think it's going to have to. If it's imposed by the state of California, these emission reduction standards, then the vessels are going to have to comply if they want to come through California. But somebody's going to have to make the first move, right? The first person through the door gets the bloodiest.
Right.
So I imagine the major carriers will have to take that on first. It may then funnel down to the smaller carriers or smaller vessels.
And you referenced earlier the evolution in vessel size having an impact on you, and now using 2,000 TEU vessels as feeders. Do you see continued evolution in vessel size? I mean, we've been talking about reaching, a point of no return on vessel size for years, and they seem to be getting larger and larger. What do you see?
Well, from our perspective, that we're limited because of our 35-foot draft on the delta, which we were trying to get deepened. But there are also some other reasons we can't get the larger vessels in, the auto vessels and things like that. The smaller vessels, we are seeing that these feeder vessels are being purchased. So if you have a smaller company that's wanting to move their product, it gets tied in with a large super vessel. They take a back seat to it. So if they can get their own smaller feeder vessel, then I think that's a progression we will see. I actually think we'll see smaller vessels for containers at least.
What size are you talking about?
Like I said, the 2,000 TEUs.
The 2,000 TEUs. And you also talked about the impact on cargo handling equipment from the mandates as well. But do you see any changes in how we move cargo on the land side?
From bulk and break bulk?
Yeah.
Not really, and not at this point. There are things that we're doing from an environmental perspective, covering containers, where you have skirts on ship loaders where you're not getting dust, so keeping the dust down, things like that. But there's only one way to get the commodity into a vessel, and there's one way to get it out of a vessel right now.
What about any changes to the workforce in terms of the skills that they're going to need to be effective on the job? It's sounding like it's a way to move cargo that's been in place for years, and if it works, don't fix it. But are you seeing other things that you think would be beneficial for an effective workforce?
Yeah, we are. There are some things that are being more automated from conveyance, especially outbound, from outbound conveyance. The way the commodity is getting put into the hopper to the conveyor, that's a little more automated, less risk. But what I see, anything that we do is from a safety perspective, where it may not improve efficiency, but it's going to improve safety. And that's something I've seen at other ports as well, as far as way they cover rail cars, things like that, going from tarps to EcoFab lids, just simple things. It takes a lot of the danger out of the roll.
What about the workforce for the port itself? You mentioned 120 employees. Is their job changing? What do they need to know now that maybe they didn't 10 years ago, and what are they going to need to know 10 years from now?
Well, it's growing. We need more people for sure. As we get busier, we need more folks. We're starting to focus on some public affairs and governmental affairs, environmental more than we have. The operations and maintenance, that will change as equipment evolves, as we go to electric vehicles, things like that, then that'll change the type of mechanic we need, for example.
And what about data management and analytics, that sort of thing? Is that something that you see yourself needing more in the future?
Probably. We haven't gotten there yet, but it's something that needs to happen. Again, I've been there 9 months, so
fair enough.
Give me a little bit of time. We talk in a couple of years, and we'll see. But I do see, as we grow, we need to become more efficient on the paperwork side.
Yeah, and it's good for us to know, because in the education sector, we want to be preparing people to be effective on the job on day one. So if you have thoughts about things that we can be doing better, it's good for us to know. I mean, thoughts about what types of training programs, what type of skill sets, that's of value.
Yeah, we are starting to work with the San Joaquin County of Education on a project, and we're starting to work with the Delta College and Stanislaus State, kind of an apprenticeship program. And right now we're not sure where that's going to be, whether it's going to be IT or whether it's going to be HR, or whether it's going to be operations, maintenance. We don't know yet, but that's something we're just starting to work on, just to try and get a funnel to the maritime industry. And
this would be apprenticing at the port itself, or within the sector more broadly defined?
Both. We're working with tenants, and so we're putting out to tenants, some of our larger tenants, to see if they have a need, but the Port of Stockton as well.
And so this would be a partnership with the education sector to do training, and then presumably you'd have partners to do placement as well.
Exactly.
That's something that we're certainly seeing as a need, particularly now where we've got transitions and turnover in the workforce, and keeping well-trained employees is certainly, I would think, would be a benefit to the industry.
Absolutely.
As a whole. We talked also about the environment as sort of being one of the priorities for California, but part of a sort of a broader social trend at the national level and awareness of environmental issues. I'm curious what other social, economic trends you see impacting the trade sector moving forward.
Well, for what we see a lot at the Port of Stockton specifically is location to neighborhoods and being sensitive of the type of commodity that we're running, the truck traffic moving through these neighborhoods. That's something that we're very concerned with, because we do have a neighborhood that right up against the Port of Stockton that does get impacted. So we're working right now on a traffic study plan to see if we can shut down truck routes through that neighborhood.
And that's certainly important, right? Which suggests, need to be aware of communication strategies and how you sort of sell what the port does in a way that communicates its importance while mitigating some of its impacts, possibly.
Right. That's something we've been very lucky at. our environmental group has started to do community outreach. So we'll have quarterly calls with stakeholders, neighborhood, environmental groups. We are touring a lot of the school children and the neighbors around the port, just to let them see, here's what we're doing, here's what we're trying to do to make their life better. We put a tremendous amount of money back into the community where we can as well.
One of the other things you mentioned, sort of trade going through a neighborhood. We have opportunities now with additional dollars for infrastructure investment coming down from the national level. And we know that there are bridges and roads that are in disrepair. What do you see as sort of the major infrastructure challenges and opportunities that would make the Port of Stockton's life easier?
Rail, without a doubt. Right now, like I said, we have 2 intersecting railroads. We have 75 miles of rail track on the port. We have 1 entrance, single track. So we're working on double track. We're working on rail hardening. We're increasing the bridge size between the islands, and we're working longer term on another access route to our West Island. So rail infrastructure is the biggest issue for us.
Yeah, and again, this is something that would benefit, I presume, the state as a whole if you get better access.
Absolutely.
In and out.
Yeah.
It can only be a positive, which sort of gets to my next point, which is the future of California as a trade leader. With so much competition and pressure from some of the factors that we talked about, how well positioned is the state to remain competitive and in a leadership role as a trade hub moving forward?
I think we are, as long as the prices stay competitive, and what's going to drive those rates up are maybe some of the requirements, environmental requirements that are put in place. Is that going to drive our prices too high? Some of the labor costs, is that going to drive our prices too high? It's based on labor, for example, it may be cheaper to move something through Texas than it is California, just because of the union labor force. But there's not the depending where the commodity is going, there may not be the ease from the Asian market. But I think ag, at least from where the port is, ag is probably the biggest push, and I think hopefully we'll remain competitive there. But there's a lot of environmental issues that impact that as well, water availability, things like that. So as long as the ag market stays strong in the Central Valley, then we'll always be a viable.
Do you see a shift in the markets for the products? I mean, do you hold hope that there's an international market that's yet untapped that you can be part of servicing?
Not really, unfortunately. The Asian markets for the commodities that we do and the commodities that are, if you're looking at something that's mined in Nevada or Arizona or Wyoming, these concentrates and soda ash, the Asian market is the market. So that's where the manufacturing is happening. So when we have these raw commodities that are going out from California, they're going to where the things are being produced. That's China is really the driver. So I think as long as the tariffs stay in check, then that keeps us competitive.
I know on the containerized side, we've sort of seen concerns about sort of a shift in the geographic balance of trade as production moves further west in Asia, that making Suez more competitive than perhaps all trans-Pacific trade. I'm just curious whether from a sort of a global, a geopolitical or perspective, are there things that are on your radar screen that you'll be tracking, whether it's consumer demand at the global level or investments made elsewhere that really matter to you?
Well, I think from an import perspective, that's still going to drive things that are coming. Asia are going to come to the West Coast for import. From an export perspective, as long as our bulk, and I'm just talking bulk at this point, as long as our bulk commodities remain competitive, and for example, soda ash is a good example. There's natural soda ash, which is more expensive than synthetic soda ash. So these users of the product may shift their ideas on what they need to use. Can they afford to use a synthetic, less high quality soda ash for lower price? And that's where I think we may have some issues when you look at these type of commodities? Is there a place where they can be mined cheaper and sent out cheaper, whether it's South America or even the European market? So,
and in terms of sort of building maybe a domestic market, is that something as well? And maybe it's the rail links that help you do that, but are there other facets of sort of U.S.-based trade that will matter to you in the future?
It will matter to me because it'll take the port out of play. If things are staying domestic, then it's not moving through. I'm assuming that's what you're asking, right? So if these commodities are going to a U.S. smelter, they're not going overseas. That obviously is going to impact us. That's not something I'm worried about quite yet because the manufacturing is still happening overseas.
Well, as we wrap up our time together, Kirk, I sort of want to thank you for a fascinating discussion. It's really important. I think everyone knows about what the Port of Stockton does and its contribution to the state and the nation. So my last question to you is, what do you think it's most important that an audience of policymakers know about what you do, and what story is it that they should be hearing when you talk about the contributions of the port?
Yeah, I think that we're a viable alternative. All the focus, as you mentioned earlier, is on the container market, but we are a potential and viable alternative to that, whether it's a different way of thinking how the commodities moved or if it even is containers. And we do need some assistance on that. If containers are going to happen through the Port of Stockton, then we do need some legislative assistance to make that happen. But realizing that there all are alternatives to the big three in California.
Good. I think that's an important message to take away, and I want to thank you for spending your day with us here on Ports Day in California. It's appropriate. So my appreciation for informing the audience about Stockton, informing me as well. And I'd like to thank you as well. I hope you'll join us around the negotiating table the next time we gather for Trade Talks, where our guest will be Kristen DeJesus, the port director from the Port of Hueneme, as we continue this series of port director discussions sponsored by the Harbor Association of Industry and Commerce. Thank you. Until next time, I'm Tom O'Brien. Thank you for joining us for this very special episode of Trade Talks. My thanks to our guest, Kirk DeJesus, Director of the Port of Stockton, and the Harbor Association of Industry and Commerce. You'll find more information about HAIC's work and the ways you can become engaged in all of its programs, including its policy, professional development, and education-related programs at the link below.